The katana didn't just change how samurai fought, it redefined the very nature of combat itself, shifting warfare from mounted cavalry charges to lightning-fast close-quarters duels, where victory was decided in milliseconds. When we think about revolutionary weapons in history, we often picture gunpowder or steel crossbows. But in feudal Japan, the most significant battlefield innovation was far more subtle: a curved blade worn edge up instead of edge down. That simple change in orientation enabled an entirely new form of combat that would dominate Japanese warfare for over 300 years. The story begins in the 13th century, when Japanese blacksmiths were perfecting something called selective tempering. This wasn't just better metalworking, it was a complete reimagining of what a sword could be. Previous Japanese blades, particularly the tachi, were heavy, designed for mounted combat, whereas samurai would ride down his enemies with powerful overhead strikes. But selective tempering allowed smiths to create blades that were simultaneously thinner, lighter, and sharper than anything that came before. The key breakthrough was learning to heat treat different parts of the blade differently. The cutting edge would be made extremely hard and sharp, while the spine remained flexible enough to absorb impact without breaking. This created a weapon that combined the best qualities of previous designs while eliminating their weaknesses. Where the tachi was a cavalry saber, the katana became something entirely new, a precision instrument for close-quarters combat. But here's what's fascinating about the katana's development. It wasn't invented overnight. This wasn't some genius blacksmith having a eureka moment. Instead, the katana evolved gradually over 2 centuries, reaching its mature form around the 15th century. And that timing wasn't coincidental. It perfectly aligned with a dramatic shift in how wars were being fought. During the early samurai period, combat was dominated by mounted warriors fighting in open fields. Picture 2 armies of horsemen charging at each other across rice paddies, each samurai trying to strike down enemies while controlling his horse. The tachi was perfect for this, a long, heavy blade worn edge down that could deliver devastating cuts from horseback. But by the Muromachi period, everything was changing. Conflicts were increasingly fought in castle courtyards, narrow city streets, and inside buildings. Suddenly, that long cavalry sword became a liability. Try swinging a 3-foot blade in a hallway, and you'll understand the problem immediately. The katana solved this with elegant simplicity. At roughly 2.5 feet long, it was perfectly sized for confined spaces. But the real innovation was in how it was carried. While the tachi hung from the belt, edged down like a European sword, the katana was tucked through the belt edge up. This completely changed the dynamics of drawing the weapon. With the edge facing up, a samurai could draw and cut in a single fluid motion. This technique, called aijutsu, gave warriors a massive advantage in surprise encounters. Imagine facing an opponent in a narrow castle corridor. With a traditional sword, you'd draw, raise the blade, then strike, 3 distinct movements. With a katana, you'd draw upward in a cutting motion, potentially ending the fight before your opponent could even clear his scabbard. This rapid draw capability became crucial during the Sengoku period from 1467 to 1615, what historians call the heyday of the katana. This was Japan's age of warring states. When the country was torn apart, by constant civil warfare. During these 150 years of almost continuous conflict, the katana reached the peak of its military importance. The Sengoku period created massive demand for weapons, forcing swordsmiths to work at unprecedented scales. They had to produce functional blades for common foot soldiers, while also crafting exquisite weapons for warlords and high-ranking samurai. This dual pressure pushed swordsmithing innovation in two directions simultaneously: practical battlefield weapons and artistic masterpieces that became family treasures. But the Sengoku period also brought another fundamental change: the rise of Ashigaru foot soldiers. Where earlier warfare had been dominated by individual samurai duels, battles now involved large formations of common soldiers. The old naginata polearms and long tachi swords became obsolete almost overnight, replaced by yari spears for formation fighting and katana for close combat. The katana was perfectly adapted to this new reality. Its length and balance made it ideal for fighting among infantry formations, where space was limited and speed was everything. A skilled swordsman could move through a battlefield engagement, cutting down enemies with lightning-fast draws and strikes that were impossible with heavier weapons. The Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 represents the katana at the height of its battlefield relevance. This massive engagement, which unified Japan under Tokugawa Ieyasu, saw thousands of samurai wielding their katana in what would prove to be the weapon's last great moment of military significance. After Sekigahara, when Ieyasu established his shogunate, only samurai were permitted to wear swords, making the katana not just a weapon, but the exclusive symbol of Japan's warrior class. Yet even as the katana reached its cultural peak, the seeds of its military obsolescence were already planted. Portuguese traders had introduced Tanegashima muskets to Japan in the 1540s, and by the late 1500s, firearms were beginning to change battlefield dynamics. The age of personal combat between sword-wielding warriors was giving way to formations of gunners and pikemen. This transition accelerated dramatically with the beginning of the Edo period in 1603. The Tokugawa shogunate brought unprecedented peace to Japan, lasting over 250 years. For the first time since the katana's development, there were no major wars to fight. The weapon that had revolutionized warfare suddenly found itself without a war. But rather than disappearing, the katana underwent a remarkable transformation. Stripped of its practical military function, it became a powerful cultural and symbolic artifact. Sword-fighting schools like the Yagyu Shinkaja-ryu and Naiten Ichi-ryu preserved combat techniques through formalized kata. But the emphasis shifted from battlefield effectiveness to discipline, precision, and personal mastery. This symbolic dimension of the katana had always existed alongside its military function. For a samurai, the blade was never just a tool of war. It embodied their honor, their social status, and their very identity. The phrase, "the sword is the soul of the samurai," wasn't metaphorical. Losing the right to carry a katana meant losing a fundamental part of who you were in Japanese society. During the peaceful Edo period, this cultural role flourished. The katana became central to Bushido philosophy, representing the ideals of loyalty, honor, and self-discipline that defined samurai culture. Master swordsmiths elevated blade making to an art form, creating weapons of breathtaking beauty that were as much sculpture as they were tools. But even this cultural role couldn't survive the massive changes that swept Japan in the 19th century. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 ended the feudal system and abolished the samurai class entirely. Just 8 years later, in 1876, the government issued the Haitore Edict, banning public sword carrying by all except military and police. This law devastated the katana's world. Thousands of samurai families were forced to sell their ancestral blades or melt them down for scrap metal. Centuries of swordsmithing tradition nearly vanished overnight as demand collapsed and master craftsmen found themselves without purpose. For many samurai, losing their swords felt like losing their souls. Yet the katana story didn't end there. The martial arts schools that had preserved sword techniques during the Edo period adapted once again, transforming combat training into formalized physical practice and cultural preservation. This evolution ultimately gave birth to modern kendo, ensuring that katana techniques and principles would survive into the contemporary world. Today, we can see the katana's revolutionary impact on warfare with historical perspective. This wasn't just a better sword, it was a weapon that enabled entirely new tactical doctrines. The transition from tachi to katana paralleled the shift from cavalry-dominated warfare to infantry combat, from individual duels to formation fighting, from open-field battles to urban warfare. But perhaps most remarkably, the katana represents a unique moment in military history where a weapon transcended its original function to become a cornerstone of cultural identity. Few weapons have ever made such a complete transition from battlefield tool to enduring symbol while retaining their essential character. The katana changed samurai warfare by enabling rapid draw combat techniques perfectly suited to close quarters fighting. But in the end, it changed something broader. It helped shape a warrior culture whose influence continues to fascinate us today. In a world where military technology changes at lightning speed, there's something compelling about a weapon that remained essentially unchanged for centuries, not because it couldn't be improved, but because it had reached an optimal balance of form and function. That perfection wasn't just in the steel or the craftsmanship, it was in how completely the katana embodied the ideals and needs of the culture that created it. And perhaps that's the most important lesson the katana teaches us about warfare. The most revolutionary weapons aren't always the most advanced, but the ones that most perfectly match the warrior who wields them.